Hello and welcome to Finding Your Holy Grail, a show produced through Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. We would like to thank station manager Jeannie White and CEO Lillian Caldwell. I am your host, Dr. Mandy Simon. I'm excited to be taking forward the conversation from last week and continue serving you by starting off 2021 with practical guidance on goal setting that can actually be achieved. This is the show's focus throughout January, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-creator, Dr. Gordon McMillan, as we continue to build skills on living fearless in the post-pandemic world. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you, Mandy. Today, we're excited to be unpacking the concept of belief systems and explaining why they're so important in helping us to achieve the goals that we set. It's great to be in our third week focusing on goal setting for 2021. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're devoting this entire month to unpacking perceptions of fear, our levels of resilience, our own belief systems, and having greater awareness of how to identify our blind spots. We hope that our listeners will use all this knowledge to make sure the goals they wrote down on the 1st of January are actually the goals they can achieve, as opposed to the goals they think they can achieve. This will ensure we manifest the future we choose for ourselves by defining and working towards our own goals.
That's right. And what is really important to understand as a nuance here is that we're not asking you to lower the bar in terms of the goals that you're setting when we use the terminology goals you can actually set. What we're doing is we're really trying to talk about how, when we understand the interplay of these different topics that we unpack each week, that it can have such a huge impact and effect on our ability to achieve a goal that we write down. So understanding our belief systems is such an important part of living a fulfilled life during times of such uncertainty, which, make no mistake, we are currently in. So when we know how to depend on ourselves, we can more easily and joyfully serve others. We've talked about this before, and we're absolutely passionate about this subject and are presenting what we think will be really helpful strategies for setting and achieving goals that you can actually achieve. And for our listeners, this is exciting because understanding this will definitely change your life for the better.
Right, and that's it. So we're not just prioritizing and being practical about our objectives for the year ahead. We're actually approaching the whole exercise of goal setting from an entirely new perspective. And this requires us to think through the mechanics of ensuring your aspirations become a reality. And we will learn today that when we're not constrained by our own self-limiting beliefs, it's amazing what we can achieve.
And people's belief systems are incredibly important because they exert a powerful influence over how any of us responds to a given situation or circumstance.
In fact, as we will come to see, our belief systems actually define the extent of the opportunities and options that we think are available to us when we have to deal with things that are unexpected in life.
Belief systems are passed on to us at very young ages. They help us to form the identities of who we perceive we are and how we develop into the individuals that we ultimately believe we are. Belief systems are greatly influenced by our culture, our religion, our language, and the choices that we make about where we fit into society. Some of these decisions are made for us, and some of them we make for ourselves. Thus, no two individuals ever think the same, but they do share commonalities of preferences and respond in similar ways based on the attributes of their belief systems.
And in the instances when we are free to unchoose our belief systems, we rarely do. Mostly because our belief systems help us to form our identities and our personalities. So if we unchoose them, who are we really? This is a complex topic, and we will visit the power of this scenario a little bit later on. But the point is that mastering beliefs is so empowering because it actually helps us to move simply beyond surviving to thrive and grow by creating our lives the way we'd like them to be.
Yes, and it is important to understand that how a person understands their actions and reactions to any given situation is dependent on their underlying belief system. Depending on the circumstances at play, it will either prevent them or enable them to become more fearful or less fearful. Therefore, how we as individuals ultimately manage the action, which is our conscious thought, and or our reaction, which is our unconscious thought, is influenced by our level of resilience, and this is specifically driven by our underlying belief system. And we introduced this interplay when we started talking about the role of fear. Belief systems are important in the discussion regarding fear because if a person, for example, believes strongly in God and thinks the pandemic is how they are being punished for some aspect of a wrongdoing that they themselves or society as a whole has done, they will not believe that they have any way to positively change their lives during the pandemic. They will instead occupy a mindset, which is based on their belief system, that they are being punished, and no amount of free will, resilience, outside help, other people's views can mitigate this or change this for them. They will then adopt a defeatist attitude about the current state of the world, which carries, in this example, a negative connotation. Because here, the current ongoing pandemic of fear due to COVID-19 actually hobbles their ability to have a positive influence over their own mental health. This is illustrated in the example of suicide rates in Japan increasing since the pandemic. In October 2020, more people in Japan committed suicide that month than all of the people that died from COVID in the entire year.
And this is an extreme example, but in this instance, people can begin to feel as though they do not have any different choices available to make, based entirely on their belief systems. And it's this absence of choice that gives us less control of our daily environment. The perception of not having a choice in life negatively affects any resilience that we might have built up. And in these circumstances, fear escalates and our minds and bodies become weaker.
And in this case, our energy levels will decrease and they will head in a downward spiral. And we will begin to look outside of our own abilities for answers and become susceptible to making choices that are driven by fear. This loss of self-sovereignty will persist until a force equal or greater to the current belief system can reverse the downward momentum.
Right, so this is a roundabout way of establishing the role of fear, the interplay between a person's level of resilience and the belief system that any individual prescribes to. From here, we're going to start providing some really useful examples about how our belief systems actually limit our lives. And when we understand what limits us, we can then start pushing past these boundaries and making different decisions based on our heightened awareness. This choice to act differently removes the limiting barriers of our belief systems and it creates new opportunities in our lives.
I think this is the exciting part. We have already had the discussion regarding how a belief system about religion can cause someone to look at the pandemic a certain way. The example we provided made the assumption that the individual saw the pandemic as negative because it was a punishment. This is that same question that many of us went through at university, where we read books like When Bad Things Happen to Good People, for example. But in truth, there are a lot of individuals out there with the belief that the pandemic is a cleansing and a rebooting for Mother Nature and for societies in a good way. My point is that when we set goals we want to actually achieve, We must be awakened enough to understand not only our own fear responses and be clear on our ability to be resilient, but we must also understand how our belief systems, based on the situation at hand, will either limit us or expand us in terms of possibility.
Yes, Mandy, I remember the very first time I had this kind of awareness through an exercise that you did with me, and it concerned my choice of language. I recall you explaining why it can be such a self limiting thing to use language in a conditioned way, rather than by actively choosing language to suit your mindset that we're trying to project on the world.
Ah, yes. How we use language is a great example. And let's start there with our audience and our listeners at home. I've used this example with my students, my clients, my patients, my family, my friends. And this is to get them to choose their words more intentionally. And this is because the words that we have cause us to elicit a conscious and an unconscious effect on our bodies and our minds. These affect our perceptions of how much control we have in a given situation, and language is a very strong influencer of these forces. The most helpful example is the use of the word deadline. I don't use the word deadline, yet it is one of the most commonly used and frequently used words in our vocabulary, at least in Western culture. Instead, I use the word timeline. And then I had a descriptive element to the word. I will say something like, it's been really nice chatting with you, but I need to go because I have a project timeline coming due in a few hours. I never say I have to go because I have a deadline to meet or a deadline is looming. And as you are aware from the work that we've done together, I don't use this word because, firstly, the use of the word dead with the word line gives our minds the impression that something bad is going to happen, as evidenced by the definition of the word dead. The other reason I don't use this word is because our unconscious decision maker, which is actually our body, reads deadline as a stress response. And this is because the word has a bloody history. Deadline was literally where prisoners of war were shot during the American War of Independence. And the word dates back from the 1860s and refers to a line either within or around a prison which prisoners of war were not permitted to cross. They would be shot if they were ever caught trying to cross the dead line. The most brutal of which was in Georgia, and we won't get into this, but the prison was notorious for poor conditions, harsh punishments, and for you, you guessed it, having deadlines. So when we use words like this all the time, we're consistently stressing our minds and our bodies. And this creates anxiety and other unfavorable responses in our nervous system. I find this example to be powerful in terms of how we are conditioned to use words that are commonly found in language. And it can be so harmful to our ability to feel in control of our lives when we use these words. The truth is that if your mind has dis-ease from the use of the word dead, and your body has unrest from the conscious events that are triggered by using the word deadline, you are no longer in firm control of your actions or your reactions.
Yes, absolutely. And when I learned to substitute my use of language and not use the word deadline, I did actually feel more in control of my life. It's a strange thing to explain, but I definitely recommend to our listeners to try it at home. It really opens up a person's world to new possibilities.
It's true, Gordon. And I'm glad that this was such a useful example for you. And I hope that our listeners at home find this to be the same for them. In fact, many people's belief systems are really important because they exert a powerful influence over how we respond to any given situation or circumstance. Our belief systems determine the extent of agency or free will that we think that we can have in our lives. For our listeners, it can be useful to provide a dictionary definition of agency, which refers to the capacity of an individual to act independently and make their own free choices based on their will. Loosely stated, this is how powerful we think we are in defining our own futures. And in truth, it's a state of mind which is heavily influenced by culture and whatever culture we were brought up in. And in this example, using the word deadline is actually in line with this idea or concept of agency. Another term that people commonly use is self-sovereignty. It doesn't much matter what you refer to it as. It's the concept that's important.
For example, in some traditional cultures, people believe they actually have very little control over what happens in their lives. For them, the plot has already been set, and they are simply passive travelers on a journey through life which involves arranged marriages, extensive families, in adherence to time-honored customs and patterns of behavior. Children are brought up doing what they're expected to do because there's no point in doing otherwise. Nothing you can do will alter the amount of good fortune or success you might experience whilst you're here on Earth. There is no agency if you believe the outcome of your life is entirely in the hands of the gods. In this context, your main role is to exist. Western cultures are at the other extreme. Here, people believe that they can do whatever they want with their lives. In America, for example, it is wholly about the individual. So the terms commonly used are I am, I have, I did. Here there is full agency, and children are encouraged to devote their lives to realizing their dreams. What do you want when you grow up? Become an astronaut? A film star? A sporting hero, perhaps? In this cultural context, you get to decide the outcomes of your life. The ability to act independently and to make free choices is everything.
And it's really quite important for our listeners at home to understand that in both of these extreme examples, we acknowledge that we have simply put forth stereotypes and that not everyone from every culture fits into these molds. As well, there's absolutely no judgment about whether one is better than the other. We use these examples to illustrate for our listeners the role of typical belief systems so that each individual listening can figure out for themselves how to identify beliefs that they may want to keep or change or simply would have never thought about before now.
And as we mentioned before, which a point I'd just like to re-emphasize, is that the belief systems actually define the extent of the opportunities and the options which we think are available to us as we plan ahead. And this is why they're so fundamental when it comes to setting goals that we can actually achieve.
Yes. And this is why I said at the beginning of the show today that we're not actually suggesting you lower the bar on your goals when you say, these are the goals I can actually achieve. It's allowing you to take this 360-degree view and understand where you fall in it so that the goals that you choose are in line with your beliefs, your fear responses, and your levels of resilience. Today, I want to bring in a view before we go of an example of what I call conditioned behavior, which for some people is how they grew up. To do this, I want to use an example of one of my patients. My patient in this example was 10 pounds overweight, and they said that no matter what they did, they could not lose that pesky extra 10 pounds. Now, I had worked with this patient for a while, and I really wanted to help them, and being healthier was important to them. But they had a hard time moving around because they had really bad arthritis in their joints. They were more elderly. Anyway, I knew this person drank a lot of coffee. In fact, they drank 3 cups of coffee per day, one at breakfast, one at lunch, and one at dinner. And in their coffee, they actually added 3 teaspoons of white sugar. That is 9 teaspoons of added sugar per day, which over the course of the year is 3,285 teaspoons of sugar per year that they consumed. I felt that this was a good place to start. So I asked my patient if they needed their coffee to have sugar, and they said, absolutely. It would be impossible to enjoy coffee without the sugar. And I asked them why. They told me because this is how they had always drank their coffee. When I unpacked this more with the belief that my patient had, it turns out they drank their coffee with 3 teaspoons of added sugar because this is how their parents drank their coffee. And so this is how they grew up conditioned to drink their coffee as well. I refer to this as a changeable belief system, but one that controls our behaviors and can have negative consequences in our lives.
Ah, I think I see where you're going with this example, and I can relate to the situation. I wonder if any of our listeners have examples or thoughts about changeable belief systems like this that are effectively conditioned responses.
In truth, we all do this. In this example, I explained to my patient that based on the conversion factor of teaspoons of sugar to pounds of fat in the body, that if he stopped drinking sugar in his coffee, that he would lose the equivalent of 15 pounds in 1 year by not changing anything else in his diet or exercise. And of course, he thought I was crazy. Firstly, he said, look, I can't drink coffee without sugar because it would taste terrible. And second, there is no way 9 teaspoons of sugar translates to 15 pounds of body fat. So I set to work to disrupt his belief system. I asked him to make his coffee every time with 3 teaspoons of sugar. And on the 3rd teaspoon, just with his finger, flick off a few grains of sugar. And I challenged him to do this every day with his coffee, every time he made his coffee. I explained that if he slowly made this adjustment, his body would not even miss the sugar. And when he did this, he had to explain to his mind at the same time that his parents would be very proud of him for losing 15 pounds. And that would help him break the emotional bond of the sugar in his coffee that was representing love. For our listeners at home, this should remind you of the example from our episode in the role of fear in goal setting, which was about the chocolate cake representing love. So I want you to start to understand the real importance of understanding concepts like fear and resilience, and now belief systems in setting goals that we can actually achieve.
I love it. Mandy, this is another really powerful example and actually a really common scenario. Thank you so much for sharing this story. It's such a great illustration of how we can reclaim our own agency in life and really put ourselves back in the driving seat to achieve our goals. I hope for our listeners at home, you found this discussion to be useful and enlightening, because I know I've really enjoyed it.
I've been very fortunate to work with so many patients and clients and students that have helped me bring these examples into the light. And I think that that brings us to a natural stopping point in this week's discussion of belief systems. It's really amazing how many factors contribute to our ability to actually achieve the goals that we set in life. Next week, we look forward to exploring blind spots, which will really help all of us move forward into a much brighter and better and easier 2021.
How good is that? But before we go, let me please take our listeners back to the beginning of our discussion today. It's pretty easy for us to define our goals for the coming year. But as we mentioned before, the tricky bit is how we make our dreams come true. But it doesn't have to be this way. And that's the point of this show. During the month of January, we're looking into the role of fear, resilience, belief systems, and blind spots, because we want you to live your best life and we want to make 2021 your best year ever, irrespective of the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're going to set you up so you can achieve every goal that you set your mind on.
And I hope for our listeners at home that you wrote down your goals on January 1st, just like all the other years before. But I'm also going to make sure that I cover this week's homework so that you can be ready by the month's end to modify any of your New Year's resolutions and absolutely achieve the goals that you set. So, this week's challenge for each of you listening from home is number 1, consider how your belief systems influence your perception of the world. Make sure you list at least 5 and identify if they are changeable or static for you. 2, list 5 deeply held beliefs or core values which you have been nurtured along in your life from childhood to have. Then decide if you continue to hold them because it was conditioning or if you really want to hold on to them. Lastly, we're asking you to write down 5 words which you can incorporate into your everyday use and adopt a more positive and progressive outlook on the world. Use the example we gave here as substituting timeline for the word deadline. Another example could be using language to say, I feel sad, instead of saying, I am sad. Because the truth is that when we say, I am sad, it doesn't give our subconscious mind or body the freedom to understand that we are not actually sadness. There's a very important nuance there that I invite all of you to think about at home. And when you connect to this show, there is always a workbook where these activities are listed for you. So be sure to click on those and open up the workbook.
Right, but our time is up for this week. So we want to thank Passionate World Talk Radio for providing a platform on their internet radio station for this show, Finding Your Holy Grail. For more information, please go to www.passionateworldtalkradio.com. To subscribe to our community, go to www.findingyourholygrail.com and write to us at findingyourholygrail@gmail.com.
To all of our listeners tuning in from home, we're so pleased to have you join us on this journey. Until next week, keep well and stay brave. And remember, dive into the homework or the call to action, because understanding how your belief systems control you or set you free is an important step on the journey to living the life that you dream of living.